This video is for anyone who wants to get into Nerf modding and is asked the question, which blaster should I mod first? This one, the Nerf Zombie Strike SledgeFire. In its stock form, it shoots a 3-dart shell. I'll show you how to single it down, give it a gasket breech to help unlock its war-capable potential. With a good air seal. Here is a quick list of the parts and tools you'll need for this project. You will need some super glue. This particular type of Shelly's is actually a flexible super glue and it doesn't quite adhere and melt to plastic, but it does the trick anyway. Part of this tutorial will be a spring replacement, and we will be using a Century Spring Corporation C836 spring. You will also need some cutting tools, a pipe cutter, a pair of flush cutters, and an X-Acto knife. A pair of needle nose pliers, a pipe reamer, sandpaper of multiple grits for grinding stuff down, a Phillips screwdriver, one with a narrow enough stem so it will be able to fit into the screw ports of the blaster, but with a broad enough head that it's not going to strip the screws, and a big old flathead screwdriver. We will be using this as a blunt force chisel, as well as a hammer to hit it with. A large inlet valve washer. These are used to seal the inlet valve of toilets, and these particular ones are made out of silicone. You will also need some barrel material. For my barrel material, I'm using Australian standard electrical conduit. I'm using a piece of 16mm, 20mm, and 25mm. These ones slide into each other nicely. It doesn't really matter what kind of barrel material you use. You will also need a piece of foam for a plunger head buffer. This is just a piece of packing foam, and dare I say it, hot glue and a glue gun. And of course you're going to need a SledgeFire. There will be a tools and parts list in the description of this video, along with product links, so if you're hard pressed trying to find these things locally, we may be able to find some links for you to buy it online, as well as affiliate links if you want to help support the channel. So let's get cracking. Start by unscrewing all the screws of the main body of the blaster. We do not have to open up the breech and barrel just yet. Fortunately, all the intricate moving parts are contained within an internal shell. Remove the internal shell and plunger tube from the blaster. The internal shell is held together by some external clips. Undo these one by one, then place the internal casing on the table and then carefully open it. Before we continue, a quick explanation of the wonderfully simple mechanics of the blaster. When the breech opens, it drives back the priming bar, pushes on the lever arm, then pushes down the catch rod. The catch rod is attached by a pivoting hinge to the plunger rod, and this in turn pulls back the plunger head. What's cool is the catch rod has a series of catch teeth. This serves as a ratchet. The catch itself slips over the teeth on the catch rod, locking it in place. Closing the breech brings the priming bar and the lever arm back out of the way. The blaster is primed and now ready to fire. When the trigger is pressed, it moves up the catch and releases the spring load, thus firing the blaster. Going back, this is what you'll see when you initially open the internal shell. Underneath the priming bar and the lever arm is a breech lock. When the breech is open, this slides back and stops you from being able to press the trigger. We want to remove this. We want to be able to deprime the blaster, that way we won't dry fire. There is also a catch lock that you'll want to remove, and it stops you from pressing the trigger if you're at one of the interval teeth. Remove the parts you can and we'll release the plunger tube. On the other side of the internal case, you'll see that there is a clip on the plunger tube. This is what holds it in. Just depress that in with a screwdriver and it should slide out. Now to replace the spring. On the end of the catch rod there is a twist nub. This is what holds the catch on. With enough delicate force, you'll be able to turn this 90 degrees and then the catch should be able to come off. Followed by the spring. The particular replacement spring we're using was the cheapest strength to price ratio that I could find easily in my local area. So just slip that on. When the catch goes back on, do note it only goes on one particular way. The plastic guides are to the back and the spring is to the top. And the L of the catch rod is facing down. That way the teeth are facing up. Yes, I have put this in incorrectly multiple times. Slip the catch back on and then turn the twist nub. Now putting it back inside the internal case can be a little bit tricky because we're now using a beefed up spring. The plunger head and the plunger rod need to slide in where the plunger would be. The plunger doesn't necessarily have to be on, and the catch bar needs to go into the guide slots. On the bottom half of the inner case, there's actually a hook that the spring rests into. Pull the spring forward and then push it down into the bottom half of the shell and it should slide into this hook. After that, you can then replace the catch spring. Also note there is a tiny little torsion spring that goes on the trigger. This pulls the trigger back forward. This is not absolutely necessary, but it is convenient as it stops the trigger from getting stuck. We'll now move on to work on the plunger tube. First, we'll start by removing the air restrictors at the front. Using the X-Acto blade, cut lines between the vent holes. Do this between each one. Now grab the needle nose pliers and pull out this section. After you pull this open, the air restrictors and their little springs will come out easily. The front of the plunger tube has an overlapping 3-circle boss. This boss kind of interlocks into the stock shells of the blaster. However, we're going to be making our own shells, so we're going to need a flat surface to create a nice good seal. We'll grind this down flat using sandpaper. I'm using 120 grit painting sandpaper. This works fine on plastic, and you'll end up with a flat, rough surface. Take the flathead screwdriver. We're going to line it up to where the back of the AR assembly connects to the inside of the plunger tube, and we'll bash it out with a hammer. I did want a more elegant way of doing this, however, the front of the blaster is glued together, even though it has clips. Work your way around the inside of the plunger tube to be sure that you've broken all the connections. Once you do that, it should just fall out. Despite this being kind of violent, it actually has a pretty good finish and clears the airway nicely. Using the valve washer, we're going to make a breech gasket. That way our new barrel shell inserts will press against this nicely and give us a good seal. These valve washers are actually bigger than the shell port, so we'll be cutting them down to size. Using one of the stock shells as a stencil, you can mark out the triangle, then use the X-Acto knife to cut it. Though these valve washers already come with a hole in the middle, it is a bit smaller than the cross-section area of our barrel. So to get maximum airflow, we're going to cut these a little bit bigger. Apply the super glue to the gasket. Place it on by aligning the triangle gasket with the triangular array of the holes. This way you're covering the edges surrounding each of these holes, sealing it up, and therefore the air should come through the center. This super glue I'm using is actually a 3-minute cure super glue, so not an instant 15-second one. Practice aligning the gasket before you stick it on. Now we will make the plunger head buffer. We'll now cut out a rough circular piece of foam about 20 millimeters in diameter that will fit on the front of the plunger head. There's roughly about 15 millimeters of clearance between the plunger head and the front of the plunger tube once you've removed the AR assembly. So we want to fill up that dead space, but of course we don't want to have too much foam that it actually impedes performance and stops a full plunger head stroke. Use the super glue to now glue the buffer onto the front of the plunger head. The buffer is only really experiencing a pushing force against it, not a pulling force. If need be, you can use the sandpaper to rough up the front of the plunger head so you get a better bond. Another thing about the plunger head is it already has a really good seal inside the plunger tube. I have seen other Nerf modders fill up these backstroke vent holes, as well as add a lining of Teflon tape underneath the O-ring, but the stock air seal is good enough. Now we will modify the shell breech. Undo all the screws. Slotting into the top of the faux barrel and the shell port, this is where an L-shaped piece of plastic goes inside, attached to an extension spring. This is what ejects the shells. However, this L of plastic is a bit too long and it will actually get in the way of our new barrel we'll be making. So grab the flush cutters or snippers and trim this down. I took off about 3 to 4 millimeters. You don't want to completely remove this from the blaster, as we will use it to push the barrel back against the breech gasket. In shortening the L of plastic, you will no longer be able to use stock shells with this. However, depending on the price of your barrel material, you'll be able to make a lot more than 3, and are a lot cheaper than getting third-party 3D printed ones. Nothing against those, just this is a homemade alternative. Next, we will make the single-barreled shell. Cut a piece of the barrel material about 200 millimeters long, or 8 inches, and use the pipe cutter to get a nice, clean, equal cut. At rest, the stock shell ejector pushes the shells out about 10 millimeters. We still want our shell barrel to be aligned in the center of the shell port at this distance, so I will be cutting the 20 and 25 millimeter conduit to 15 millimeters. Also cut another 2 rings of the 20 millimeter and 25 millimeter conduit. This is what will actually be making contact with the shell ejector L. Using the reamer tool, take off the burrs and bulges caused by cutting. That way, the rings will slide on easily onto the barrel. To help with adhesion, stipple on some cut grooves using the X-Acto knife. Do the same for the inside and outside of the rings. For putting the outer rings onto the barrel, you can use the hot glue or you can use the super glue. Apply this glue closer to one end of the ring, so when you push on the outer ring, it will smear the glue between the two rings. While that cools, ream out the shorter rings and then glue them together in a similar fashion. However, we don't want to put this onto the barrel just yet. Pull out the rough sandpaper again so we can grind down some flat edges. Do this to the front side of the shorter rings that go to the front of the shell. Also do this to the back end of the barrel. This may take a while depending on how much overhang material you have to grind down. Once you've ground it down flat, we want to create a smoother surface, so that way we get a better seal against the gasket. So here I'm stepping up to a 240 grit sandpaper. I'll be skipping a whole bunch of grits, going straight to 1200 wet and dry sandpaper. By the end of it, you want to have a nice, flat, smooth surface. Once again, grab the reamer tool. We'll be using this to ream out the inner barrel. By putting in a chamfer, it'll be easy to feed in darts. Now that the back of the shell is flat and even, we now have a point to measure from. Using one of the stock shells as a measuring stick, mark out where the front rings for the shell will be going. Do note, it is better to go shorter than longer in this case, because we are using the ejector pusher to push this back against the gasket. If the shell is too long, you won't be able to close the blaster. Just to get a nice, even, straight guideline, I use the pipe cutter just to cut a tiny little groove, not too deep. Behind that line, I then stippled the barrel, pulled out the hot glue, and slid on the front ring. Note, I want the flat side facing towards the front. Now for a test fit. Our brand new barrel shell is now ejecting out of the shell port nicely. Replace all the components back inside the inner shell and close it. Then slide the plunger tube back on. Also something optional, but recommended, a can of plastic-safe silicone spray lubricant. Do note, I am using WD-40 brand, but this is not regular WD-40. Regular WD-40 will break down the O-ring, don't use it. Put the breech latch mechanism back into the main shell first, then followed by the inner case. Before you can put the inner case back into the blaster, you will need to prime it to the first catch tooth. This is just the way all the guide holes align, and you won't be able to really put it in without doing this. It might take a bit of strength, but be careful not to bend or twist the priming bar. You can now place it back into the main shell. At this point, you can also make the choice whether or not you want to continue using the stock on the back of the blaster. Replace the top part of the shell and replace all the screws. Now we can test out to see if this barrel works. Look at that, nice clean fit. We'll start with some elite darts. 155, 149, 157, 154. That's pretty good. Next we'll test out some full vinyl jacket darts. These have a solid vinyl tip. 100. Some light blue ones. Full vinyl jackets are a bit heavier than stock darts, so a FPS decrease is expected. Yeah, 105. Still pretty acceptable. If you find that your shells are a little bit wobbly, you can put some electrical tape or duct tape around the outside. Now we're going to test shooting 3 darts stuffed down a single barrel to see how that compares to the original. That's pretty good. Stock with 3 darts in a shell, we're getting about 40-ish, about that, 45. You can also put a single dart in the stock shell, and then that way the airflow will only come through the air resistor that's been pressed down, and that gets around 60. 3 darts inside one of the single shell is outperforming that. This is just awesome. It's quite satisfying to know that such a massive upgrade in performance comes from a relatively simple mod. Now, this won't be the most powerful blaster on the field, nor will it be the highest rate of fire, but it will give you a fighting chance. And if you're just starting out, you may not have access to a stockpile of 18 mags or a chest rig to use them. The beauty of this is that it is a clipless mechanism. We do have quite a bit of Nerf combat footage on the channel of me using this one I bought off my friend Greg. And I think it's in serious business. I actually get a 5 tag streak, which makes the point having enough cover on the field is a greater equalizer than pretty much anything else. So remember, if you see anyone who says which blaster I should mod first, I'd say this is a pretty good candidate. We have more mod guides on the channel, specifically of Ryan going through all the different flywheel blasters, as well as we're going to have some more mods coming up soon. If you enjoyed this video, share it around. You can also click get notifications on our Facebook page where we post updates, and thank you very much for watching. Ah! Jesus! Oh, this fucking... Oh my god! Ugh.